Yeah, done with my Oreo.
Okay, good.
Do we really know what happened?
The brother did.
The brother, that's what I thought too.
I mean, that seems like kind of obvious.
Hey, do you want to talk about death?
Yeah. I mean,
Murdery thingy.
Ooh, sorry.
Starting off with a burp.
Happy Wednesday night, everybody.
It's Wednesday night. We're
Should we have some wine later?
Oh yeah, let's. Should we have some late night wine after this?
Late night wine.
Ooh. Welcome to Mystery Murdery Thingy.
Welcome to Mystery Murdery Thingy. Who are you?
I'm Mario.
Who am I?
You are Chloe.
That's true.
Good for you.
And what was I gonna say? Are you gonna do a mystery and murder thingy?
Oh, mine is. It's like mostly a thingy. I think.
Mine's murdery.
Yeah, that's what you told me.
Good one.
Cool. Who's gonna go first?
I don't know. I don't really care.
I'll just go first then.
Okay, I want to listen.
Okay.
I like to listen.
And you do it so well.
What does that mean?
It means that you're attentive and you're engaged and you're a great partner in all ways. Aww. And I love you.
Stop.
Okay, and now I'm going to talk about a skeleton lake.
A skeleton lake, or it's called Skeleton Lake?
It's known colloquially as Skeleton Lake. So 5,000 meters up in the Himalayan mountains in this sort of northern district of India.
Oh, so it's cold.
Bordering Nepal. Very cold, very dry, very remote. It's miles away from the nearest town. And it's also this very creepy site, right? Known as Skeleton Lake or Mystery Lake. But known to the locals as it has been for forever. It's like one of these places, right, where the people who are from there know about it, but then the wider world didn't find out until later. It's known as Roopkund Lake, like in the area officially. And it came to kind of a wider prominence in 1942 when this game reserve ranger named Hari Kishan Madwal happened upon what he thought was like this really gruesome scene, right? Hundreds of human skeletons just strewn haphazardly in and around this 6-foot deep lake, a small lake nestled in this small kind of hidden valley between a peak and kind of a bluff. His macabre discovery was it was also kind of a happenstance, right, or whatever, because it like I said, it's very remote. It's like only visible. Also, the skeletons are only visible for like about a month every year, because it's so cold that it's like frozen for like almost the whole year. So it was one of these kind of like warm summer days when the ice does melt, and you can see hundreds. People think between 300 and 800 persons, remains perhaps, on the shore, kind of strewn around, like I said, and also under the water. So it's kind of like the bog bodies, if you recall, where you can kind of see it like through the water, and on some of them there's still flesh.
Right, those are extremely well preserved.
Yeah, that's very well preserved because of the cold and also the dryness of the environment. So. Yeah, at first, he kind of, or the authorities, when he told them about it, thought that it was, like, Japanese soldiers, and was, like a raid or whatever that had gone wrong, but that wasn't the case. They looked at the bones and figured out, no, they're, like, old. Like, this isn't, like, something that happened recently, because you have to remember this was, like, World War II, so they thought it was something that was, like, around the war, but it wasn't at all. But they didn't know what the fuck it was, right? And what's made it kind of harder to figure out over the years is that, unfortunately, some real fucking idiots have, over time and also recently, thought it was a good idea to take some of the artifacts, including the bones, from this site. Yeah.
Yo, that's how people get cursed.
I know, right?
That's how you die a
trigger
mysterious,
the start of a supernatural episode.
premature death.
Right. Hey, you see this bone I brought back from India?
Sam!
So these, stupid looters, sightseers, and also the frequent rock slides that happen at this location and other causes have made this, really difficult site to kind of like, examine, right, with traditional kind of anthropological, ways of kind of looking at things. It's a very disturbed site, as I guess they say. A problematic site was another word that I saw come up in my research.
Is it because it's like hard to get to, or
it's difficult to get to? It is very remote, and like I said, it's sort of not able to be accessed in some ways for a lot of the year, but also just because the remains have just been so moved and whatever by all these factors that it makes it hard to figure out what exactly is going on. So the local people with the kind of traditional explanation for this site was for what happened is this kind of legendary story about a king and a queen on a pilgrimage. And it was, according to Wikipedia, the king of Kanauj, Raja Jasdaval, maybe, with his pregnant wife, Rani Balampa. And the pilgrimage to the, quote, nearby shrine of the mountain goddess Nanda Devi, close quote, is a real pilgrimage that happens every 12 years and may go back as far as the 8th century CE.
Oh, wow.
There's only, like, real documentary evidence of it back to, like, the 16th century, I think. But there are some indications that it may go back much further. On, like, I can't remember exactly, but some more vague sources. So, according to that local legend, the king, the queen, their attendants, dancers, like, all their whole party, right? They were having a party, and they were making their way, yeah, you can think of it like, yeah, they're kind of, like, bumping along, making their way through, Roopkund, right, through this valley. Now, while doing so, they apparently were they were having a little bit too good of a time, I guess. They weren't showing the proper deference to the goddess, and therefore, with their dancing and the partying and generally not acting like the penitent pilgrims that they were supposed to, as punishment, the goddess Nanda Devi, according to legend, literally struck them down by sending enormous hailstones as large as 9 inches across, killing every single member of the party. And leaving, of course, the skeletal remains to lie under the water and around the Roopkund Lake for the next 1,200 years.
Even the king and queen?
Everyone, yes. Even the king and queen.
She was pregnant.
It's a legendary story, probably not real people, but yeah, that is very sad. Some version of this story kind of always centered around this freakish hail storm, which apparently these are real, like where they have these huge hail storms in this area sometimes, kind of pummeling these, hundreds of people to death. In this one instance, that kind of persisted in popular understanding, even to the modern day, like into the 2000s. That sort of a version of this is what most people thought happened, basically until about 2004. That was when there was another analysis done, and then the one I'm going to kind of mainly take my what was kind of one of my main sources is the most recent and complete analysis done to date, which was a paper published in Nature Communications very recently, August 20th of 2019.
Oh,
and
last
then,
week.
Right, the press around that is kind of how I heard about this story. And there was a technical paper by Edouin Arny et al. And many other people. And they did, like I said, this kind of more complete analysis. So there are a lot of mysteries that remain even after that, but some of that has been kind of defined a little bit more precisely by these analyses. So what Arny and his colleagues did was they took dozens of bone fragments, and several teeth for analysis, and they subjected these samples to a battery of what are called bioarchaeological analyses. Isn't that cool? Doesn't that sound cool? Doesn't sound like it would be a real thing, but I guess it is. Bioarchaeological analyses.
Okay.
So looking at ancient remains, essentially, to see what they can tell us. So these included tests like ancient DNA, stable isotope dietary reconstruction, which I'll get into, radiocarbon dating, and osteological analysis. The looking closely at bones. Yeah, go ahead.
diet. I know you said you're going to get into it, the diet reconstruction.
Yeah.
Without, like, knowing what that is, it sounds very fascinating.
I know, right? It sounds like you shouldn't be able to do that. You shouldn't be able to tell me generally what people were eating that lived 1,000 years ago.
Right?
Like, that's crazy. That's cray-cray in a good way.
Oh, did you make that up?
I stole it from Cleveland, so I will... That's who it was, right?
That's cray-cray in a good way.
That's Cleveland, right? Am I remembering
Well, I've never
that?
heard it before, so it sounds like Cleveland.
I'm pretty sure it's Cleveland. I
I was like super proud of you for making that up.
No, not at all. So what the tests that I talked about, what those showed most definitively was that these individuals were not, in fact, killed in one event. They just over and over again, they all reinforced that this was not one single hailstorm or anything that killed one group of hundreds of people in one single event. Rather, the dating of the samples showed clearly that there were at least 2 events, about 1,000 years apart.
What?
Around somewhere between the 8th to 10th centuries Common Era, and then a separate incident somewhere between the 18th and 20th centuries Common Era. So it could have been as
Some of them are way more recent than
some
others.
of them are way more recent, like 1,000 years apart.
Wow.
There's kind of this clear bifurcation.
That's wild.
That we'll kind of keep coming back to. So by further refining the timing of particular samples, they also showed that it's highly likely that there were also more than one event that caused the ancient deaths as well. So, earlier in that time period and later in that time period, essentially. And a prior osteological assessment, right, of looking at the bones, of many bones from Skeletal Lake, cited in that Nature Communications paper, but that happened before, seemed to rule out an ancient plague as the cause. It did show that certain individuals had, quote, unhealed compression fractures, close quote.
What does that mean?
Essentially, it's like being hit with a blunt force, but not, something like a sledgehammer, something more rounded that left an impression, but didn't necessarily, like, pierce the skull. Again, not to get into too many gruesome details, but again, we're trying to figure what exactly happened here 1,000, 1,200 years ago, which is nuts. But, with those kind of wounds seem to indicate on the heads and the shoulders of certain individuals is that this could have been that freakishly large hail of legend. Like, that could actually have been the cause of some of these people's deaths. Which does seem pretty crazy.
So maybe it was a little bit true.
Yeah, there
came from somewhere, yeah.
Exactly. There could have been some truth in that legend, which sometimes there is. Of course, it also could have been like a billion other things. Who knows? It's not entirely clear, but it doesn't rule that out, which I thought was interesting. So the osteological analysis also seemed to group the samples into 2 groups. Like I'm saying, this bifurcation. One group being larger than the other. And that bifurcation of the samples was also reinforced by the by the DNA analysis. The researchers were able to isolate 38 clear DNA profiles through a very, very complex process that they get, like, into the freaking weeds in that paper. I didn't understand, like, 90% of... So I was just, like, scrolling through parts because I was like, I don't know what they're talking about. I understand the part where they're telling me the narrative and what they did, but this, I don't know. There's, like, stuff that's, like, copywritten in here. I don't know what's going on. So, they started by essentially cleaning the bones very well and then extracting bone powder. That's what they mainly did their analyses on, with a sterile dentist's drill. Ooh. And what they found confounded their expectations. Like, they said that in the paper, which one of my sources described that verbiage in the paper as being, like, very sort of hyperbolic for a sort of staid scientific paper, right? They were essentially saying, like, this was, like, completely not what we were expecting. Like,
what happened?
This is crazy. Sort of several things. The several things that they found continued to confound their expectations, just, like, over and over again. So they identified 23 genetic males and 15 genetic females. That was not expected. especially by people who thought that this was some kind of military expedition,
Okay.
in which one would expect a smaller proportion of women than they found, presumably. None of the individuals was closely related. Like, none of them that they looked at were related to each other at all, familially. Refuting the notion that this was some kind of, group of families or something, right? Probably. So in terms of the genetic ancestry, the samples fell into 3 categories that the Nature Communications paper authors call Roopkund A, B, and C. They created these groups by comparing the samples to thousands of ancient and modern samples from known places, right? To see essentially, okay, where were these people from? Or more precisely, where does their DNA match up with where people are from now? Which may not be where people were from 1,200 years ago, but that's a complicating factor, right? So Roopkund A, that group, was made up of 23 individuals that matched the DNA of individuals currently living in South Asia, places like India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, etc. Which is kind of what you would expect, right? You'd expect all of these people
You said it was
to be
near
in this group.
Nepal, right?
Yes, this is sort of northern India in the Himalayas, very near Nepal. Roopkund B, that group, was made up of 14 individuals, and this was the really, really big surprise and everything, that those people matched the modern DNA of West Eurasian people, and more specifically, people who currently live in Greece and Crete. So this is
pretty far.
Thousands and thousands of miles away, exactly. And the Roopkund C group, which was one individual, was sort of harder to pin down, but clearly seemed to be most closely related to current East Asian inhabitants, Han Chinese, to a large degree. So, and that's kind of weird too. So, the Roopkund A group were the more ancient ones. The Roopkund B and C group were the more recent ones. So those were also 2 kind of groupings. So also, and this is the dietary analysis. So by looking at animal and plant minerals deposited in the bone collagen, researchers. So it essentially what happens is when you eat something, right? The minerals, the specific minerals in those plants or animals replace some of the minerals that are in your bones, right, within the calcium of your bones, for about 10 to 20 years. It's a record of about 10 to 20 years of what you were eating. Not exactly, but the general nature of it. And what they're able to do is glean some general insight as to the diet of these long-dead individuals by looking at the isotopes in those, which tell you where they're from. It's complicated, I know.
It's just science so
Right.
much. It's just so much.
I know. So, but the upshot, right, is essentially what the tale that this tells is that some individuals in the last 10 to 20 years of their life had eaten a diet most associated with South and Southeast Asia. They said it was high in millet, which I didn't know what that was, but apparently billions of people eat it. So, great.
You didn't, Google it?
No. So, and that's the Roopkund A individuals that had their DNA most closely matching South Asians. So the other group, Roopkund B and C, had a diet more reminiscent of Europe and Eurasia. And it also showed that those individuals had not subsisted on seafood, suggesting that they had lived far from the sea, which is to say not actually in Greece or Crete. So they had that ancestry, but maybe those in particular individuals maybe weren't actually from there. It seemed to suggest, perhaps. So, instead of kind of solving the mystery, right, of Skeleton Lake, the researchers had kind of multiplied the mysteries, right? Even if the ancient hailstorm theory is true in part, maybe, that's only one of at least 3 separate incidents that we now have to account for, right? So that just that in and of itself has tripled the mystery. And tripled the mystery. And why were all these people around Roopkund Lake to begin with, right? We still have no idea.
I wonder if it's changed a lot. Like, maybe it used to be not so remote, 1,000 years ago? I don't know.
Maybe. I'm not sure how much, people know about that. That didn't really come up in my research too much. But, well, a little bit, because we do know that even in those ancient times, it may have been part of the path, or was probably part of the path to the shrine of Nanda Devi, the goddess that I mentioned earlier. There's that pilgrimage every 12 years, at this point at least. So, anyway, that may make sense for, again, that Roopkund A group, right? The South Asians, who may have been undertaking this religious journey. But it's a bit of a stretch to think that this one East Asian and these many people who seem to have Mediterranean ancestry were also, undertaking that spiritual journey for a religion that wasn't endemic to their area. I wouldn't rule it out. It's not outside the realm of possibility. People convert, and, people you wouldn't expect to be of one religion maybe, and maybe they did become pilgrims for some reason. And that's why they ended up there too, but it seems unlikely. More likely, I think, is that there, was a completely different reason, but I don't know what that is. That's not, yeah. I'm not solving any mysteries here. So, further adding to the mystery is the researchers' inability, despite diligent research, to find a single mention of an expedition of Westerners going missing in this part of the Himalayas around that time. They just can't match it up to any story that people have known of. Some expedition that went into the Himalayas in the 19th century and were lost. They can't find it, but they're going to keep looking, I guess. So David Reich, one of the senior authors of that Nature Communications paper, put it like this to the Atlantic. Quote, "It may be even more of a mystery than before. It was unbelievable because the type of ancestry we find in about a third of the individuals is so unusual for this part of the world." Close quote. So that's kind of the nugget of the mystery. And we've done some mysteries like this before, like the one about the Tarim mummies. How did these people end up at this place in this time? It's sort of a mystery in and of itself. So more analyses of more bones and hopefully better preservation of the site, right? These dumb fuckers not taking away human remains.
Which is creepy. That's weird.
Who does that?
Not only is it
stupid.
super illegal and immoral, it's also creepy.
Yeah. What kind of person does that? I don't know. It's weird. So anyway, hopefully we'll have some more light shed on this in the future, but for now it's very mysterious and will remain so. So Skeleton Lake, Mystery Lake, Roopkund Lake. Yeah, don't go there. Just read about it. No one needs to go there. I don't know. It was on Atlas Obscura. That was one of my main sources, or one of my sources too. But
so it's not a burial ground. That's the first thing I thought.
That came up a little bit in my research, but honestly, not very much. There was one person who was like, guys, clearly this is just a burial ground. Why are we even talking about this? But I don't know. Maybe it's just because I want it to be more intriguing than that, but I'm not sure.
But I think the different time gaps, that's weird.
Right, but the thinking there is maybe people have been using it as a burial ground for a long time, but then wouldn't they be more continuous?
Exactly.
And not
versus
these two separate, yeah.
Yeah.
It's very mysterious. It's a mystery lake for sure. For sure. So my sources were Robin George Andrews at the New York Times, Rachel Gottman at the Atlantic, Edwin Arney et al. At Nature Communications, Caroline Floyd at the Weather Network, Dylan at Atlas Obscura, Gemma Tarlock at Discover, and Michelle Starr at Science Alert.
Do you say Gemma? How is that spelled?
Gemma.
That's Gemma.
Well, excuse me, Gemma. I do apologize.
It could be Gemma, but
I don't know.
That's usually pronounced Gemma.
Well, in the unlikely event that
wrong.
Someone named Gemma or Gemma is listening to this pod, please email us at mysterymurderythingy@gmail.com.
By the way, millet.
Yeah.
It's
like a grain, right?
It's actually referred to a grain often, but it's actually a seed.
Oh.
So it's like a huge staple in diets because it's also not glucose. Gluten free.
Gluten free.
And so it's a lot like quinoa, barley.
Oh, okay.
Wheat.
And you knew all that beforehand.
Totally.
You didn't just Google that.
Google? What's Google?
Google. Chloe, what's your mystery for the week?
My mystery for the week is a missing persons case.
Right, because we've been watching
This one is
Disappeared.
Yeah, at first I was like, okay, like I'll watch this. Like the description sounds good, and then I was like, oh, like there's a guy that they like. It's pretty clear that it's him, but they have no evidence. And then I'm like, wait, there's so much more than I thought to it.
Okay.
Okay, so let's go.
Cool.
So I am going to talk about the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit. So first, let's talk about Jodi Huisentruit herself. So, at the time she disappeared, she was 27. She's super ambitious, and she was a news anchor for Mason City, Iowa. She always knew she wanted to be on TV, you know, she was like very personable and very bubbly. Everybody always talked about how great of a personality she had, and like, even her sister, Joanne, was like, you know, like there's a pretty face, right? But there's also like, she had the personality to match. Her father died at age 13 from colon cancer, and they were really close, and it like had a pretty big impact on her. She was athletic, and her father actually bonded over golf, and she was really good at it. Like she did tournaments and stuff.
I wish I could play golf.
So she grew up in Long Prairie, Minnesota, a small town, and she had always wanted to get out of there, right? She's always wanted to be on TV, wanted to like dreamed big, and she was actually a flight attendant for a few years, so she did do a lot of traveling, and she eventually went into the news business. She attended St. Cloud University and became the starring news anchor at the school station. Eventually, she started recording and anchoring for a KMIT station in Mason City, Iowa. So that was it wasn't like a big break, but it was like a job that she loved, and she like worked the morning shift. She worked the morning shift and the noon shift as well. She made friends really easily, and it was kind of a stressful environment. So because of that, all of the coworkers and colleagues and stuff, they're all really close. They were all friends. They went out to the bars all the time and like would wind down and all that good stuff. She went missing on June 27th, 1995. So her morning call time is 3 a.m. Yeah, I was like, oh, okay. And Jodi could be a little late sometimes, so it wasn't super out of character that she was running a little bit late, but she wasn't like, oh, it's 4:30, like an hour and a half late. And so the producer, her name is Amy Coons, she eventually calls her. And Jodi answers the phone, and she's like, oh my gosh, oh, I'm so sorry, like, I'll be there in 20 minutes, like, she slept in. But she never showed up. Amy had to substitute and host the show herself that day.
Oh my god.
Because Jodi never showed up. Police were called, eventually, actually after the show ended around 7 a.m., and so they go over, they do a welfare check. They ride over to her apartment. They noticed that the car was still in the parking lot. And they did some searching and looked around. And when they got to her car, they found her shoes lying there. They found a hairdryer and keys that were scattered on the ground. What? They also found a palm print on the outside of the car. There were drag marks also found in the silt nearby that was leading away from the car. So it seems like she was attacked. When I heard hairdryer, I was like, oh, I bet she was like, I bet she had like wet hair and like was getting in the car and was like, I'll do this when I get there. And like, she dropped her hairdryer. Like somebody attacked her from behind or something like that.
That's so weird.
It's bizarre.
At like 5 in the morning?
Yeah, like 4:30, 5 in the morning.
That's crazy.
So they searched the apartment as well. The apartment itself looked pretty normal. Like nothing was really out of place. Nothing was like super disturbing or anything like that. They found her journal sitting on her bedtime table, and that was also pretty normal as well. It was very like positive. The investigators on the episode talked about it was like a pretty positive journal, just about herself and her ambitions and her career, and how she just wanted to like get into the bigger TV scene and stuff like that. And she never mentioned like having problems with anyone, and other people didn't necessarily have problems with her.
No enemies.
Right. They also noted that the toilet seat was found up, which is weird. Like,
because she lived alone.
yeah. So, like, was there a mail there? I don't know. They mentioned that. I was like, I don't really know how, like, big of a clue that is or what it is. But, I mean, it has some merit, I suppose.
I guess.
So they, of course, they do what, first thing investigating, they start asking neighbors, right? A few neighbors say that they heard screaming at around 4:30 in the morning. However, residents were really used to loud noise because this is a very big apartment complex, number one. Number two, they're also right next to a campground. So this wasn't something people were like, oh no, noise, call 911,
Mm-hmm.
A neighbor driving back to work that day also noted that he noticed a light-colored van parked in front of the lot, just like idling there with its lights on. And the police actually, like, which I thought was like super clever, they actually went out around to like the newspaper services and the post mail to like ask everybody, like, hey, like, because they had trucks like that, and like it was around 4:30, so they'd be starting their routes then, but like nobody was there.
They ruled that out.
Yeah, they ruled that out. So this is when the investigation starts. The police contact, I think it was after, when was she considered abducted? I think it was like 24 hours in. So the police contact the family, and they live in Minnesota, and so they head over to Iowa. The case got very, very popular. Like I said, she's a TV news anchor, right? Rumors started to spread too. There was a lot of misinformation, like, some people said that there was like a lot of blood found at the scene, and there was like, it was like all over the place, and this and the other thing. It was much more brutal than it was, and that's not true.
So often happens.
Yeah. The apartment, and it was a small town too, so word got out really fast. The apartment complex itself was like filled with people just wandering around, like being curious, and like, oh, this is where she lived, and like, I wonder what's going on. Especially, she's a familiar face. People like know who she is.
Right.
So Jodi had also been stalked before. 9 months before her disappearance, she actually put in a report about an incident where a black truck had followed her while she was jogging. And so what she actually had to like run into like somebody's house and like knock on, and like, hey,
yeah,
I'm really
like,
freaked
I'm
out
being
right
followed.
now.
Yeah. That's nuts.
Yeah, she told her sisters and her friends that she didn't feel safe, and that she eventually started taking like self-defense classes. And that truck was never found. There was never really anything that came out of that report. So this is when they start looking at John Van Cise. Now, John Van Cise is a good friend of Jodi's. He stated that he was over at her house that night, that she was over at his house that night, and they were watching a video from her surprise birthday party that John himself like organized for her. Like, oh, like, they're having such a good time, laughing, this, that, and the other thing. When police looked at the last few days leading up to her disappearance, his name kept coming up, so they went to him right away. He was also like really inserting himself into the investigation.
And that's always a red flag.
Yeah. They never had an intimate or romantic relationship or anything like that. One of the sisters in the episode talks about how Jodi would talk about John and someone else, and John and this person. It wasn't like he was like anything in particular. They were really good friends and really close and stuff like that. He also spoke about her a lot to the media, and he always talked about her in past tense, like, oh, she was my really good friend, she was so amazing. And he also said that he was, quote, the last person to see her alive, unquote.
Well, that's either inartful verbiage there or a confession, essentially. I mean, that's like if somebody said that to Jake Peralta, he'd be like, gotcha!
Nailed!
Right.
Okay.
9-9.
So, John and Jodi, they went out to the bars all the time together, their co-workers, group of friends. John's described as a, quote, charmer, and he had a lot of friends and was huge in the social scene and, like, went out to the bars pretty often. He liked buying girls drinks, this and the other thing. He was also recently divorced. He was also 20 years older than her. had once lived, and he also had once lived in the same apartment complex as Jodi as well. So when he was interviewed, his story was always consistent. It was always the same. It checked out. He said that the police noted that Jodi had been on a golf outing before going over to his place to watch the video. And when police looked into the story, they detailed the timeline more, and they saw that it didn't really add up. Now, okay, so police report that Jodi left the golf event around 8 o'clock that night, and the police know she made a call at 8:24. The problem with this for me is that, just because she made a phone call doesn't mean she couldn't have been at his house.
Right.
But they talked about it oh, there's no way, blah, blah, blah. She made a call at 8:24. They're saying it was a tight timeline for her to come over and watch a video and then go home. Unless there's something I missed, maybe there were more details about that call.
And there also might be stuff that the police knows that they're not releasing.
Right,
that typically happens.
That call was to a friend named Kelly Torson, and Kelly didn't answer the phone, but Jodi spoke with her husband, and she was like, oh, just leave her a message when she calls back. And the husband reported he talked to the police too, and he was like, yeah, we actually had a really long conversation. She was totally fine and high spirits. She was actually talking about the skiing trip that she had gone on that weekend and this and the other thing. It was it was pretty normal. Jodi's family was also a little weirded out by John. When they met up with him, they just got weird vibes. They said he was strange. They talked about how he was a bit too gleeful and almost like he wanted to be interviewed. At one point, he named his big fancy boat after her.
Wow.
And family and friends were like, hey, this is kind of weird, Jodi. And she's like, oh, no, I think it's kind of funny. But yeah. I don't know how to feel about that. Yeah. But also, it's not like they weren't strangers or anything. They were, genuinely good friends. So, I don't know. He's kind of weird. Eventually, the family... Oh, no. Yeah, so when they talked about his alibi, he says he was home alone and he woke up around 5 a.m. to take a morning walk. But there was never enough evidence to search his car or apartment or anything. There was really nothing to bring him down on. Mm-hmm. Eventually, the family headed back to Minnesota, but they stayed in contact with investigators the whole time. There was no reason for them to really be there at that point. Months go by. No leads. Lots of combing through tips that ended up being bogus. By winter of 1999, they did have a promising lead. A man named Anthony Jackson wrote a rap song called Stiffen in Tiffin that was supposed to be about Jodi Huisentruit. A dead body in Tiffin, Iowa. Tiffin, Iowa is a town that's about 200 miles from Mason City. He had a girlfriend that looked a lot like Jodi that he had broken up with 5 days before her disappearance. They looked into his background and found that he was living in Mason City at the same time that she was, and that he actually lived 2 blocks from where she worked. And at the time they were investigating it, he was in prison because turns out he's nasty. He raped 4 women in 18 days. So he was a serial rapist. Yeah, and he was arrested. They searched his car, and they also found a gun, handcuffs, and duct tape. He was described as being, really violent and somebody who would snap. Would be calm one moment, and then, something would trigger him, and he would be really violent. And that's one of the reasons why his girlfriend was trying to get away from him. Police also went to Tiffin, Iowa, and they combed the area with search dogs, but they never found any evidence. A couple years later, in summer of 2002, Gary Peterson. So Gary Peterson is also a reporter, news anchor in South Minnesota, and it was kind of a competing, quote unquote competing, station with the KMIT where Jodi worked at. And so he had been following the case. It freaked him out. And as a news reporter, he gets a lot of tips about anything, anywhere. And he got a tip. He got a weird letter from a psychic in California that was willing to do an analysis of any cold case, no charge. Barney, your face, you're like, he handed the case off to Josh Benson, another reporter, And Josh looked into it, and Josh was like, okay, like, I don't know about this. He was, like, skeptical about this kind of stuff, but they decided to look into it anyway. And the station ended up running a short piece about her, and the case becomes more and more popular after that. They actually aired a 13-part series looking into the theories and tips that were coming in. Yeah, just to test their validity and explore and stuff like that. So the case became even more popular than it was before. A tip Gary Peterson and Josh Benson eventually look into involves the death of, this is weird, involves the death of Billy Pruen, a friend of Jodi's. Now, Billy Pruen lived southwest of Mason City. He was discovered one night on the floor of his farmhouse, dead from a gunshot wound. And this had happened only weeks before Jodi's disappearance. And they knew it was unusual because he still... Okay, so they talked about how he was, like, a very, like, neat person. And he, like, drove his tractor back home and didn't take his shoes off, which he, like... That wasn't something he ever did. There was dirt in the house. And he was just, like, found on the ground with a gunshot wound in his back. The police... ruled it a suicide. I know, you're like,
always happen?
Jodi, it really bothered her. She hated it. And then she started talking about looking into it herself and trying to find out what happened. But none of the family or friends really know if, like, that's something she actually did or not. It was just something she talked about. They don't know what she did.
But it's like, if she did, maybe she stumbled on something that
Right.
she shouldn't have. And
Right.
Yeah.
Friends and family couldn't believe it. They're like, this is no way, there's no way Billy Pruen would commit suicide. It didn't make sense for him to kill himself, especially, and Gary Peterson looked into this, especially because there was, he had life insurance, and one of the life insurance clauses said that if his death was due to suicide, between, like, this period of time and this period of time, the policy wouldn't pay out.
Right, that's pretty typical.
So it's like, why there was really no motivation there. And at the time, it was only a few months away from that clause expiring. So Peterson looked into the incident himself, and he read the autopsy report. He said that the entrance wound, this was on the medical examiner's part, on the medical examiner's report, said that the entrance wound was bigger than the exit wound, and it was in, like, the middle of his back. So he believes that Billy was just murdered, shot in the back. The family eventually got the cause of death ruled to be undetermined. And really that's about it. That's about all they know. Gary Peterson and Josh Benson keep in touch with the family and tell them all about their research. They set up findjodi.com to open up the story more to the public, and that's where they keep people updated, and they write a lot about their research, including interviews and stuff with the family, and they keep tabs on stories that are coming out, and they also have a really nice timeline on there. They also looked into, they start following a lot of tips, right? So one of the tips they looked into was about a prisoner named Thomas Korskadin, who had a light-colored van, like the one the witness mentioned. And he was a known sex offender from Minnesota, and like I said, people got tips that he was involved. He had a long history of being, like, a weirdo, like a peeping Tom. He was known to be a stalker. He actually mentioned Jodi's name to the prisoners at some points, and he talked about how he knew what happened to her, and he actually wrote, like, a deposition and, like, talked about her and said he knew what happened, but they never found any evidence, never found anything even tying him to her disappearance. In June of 2008, Jodi's private journal is leaked to the media. Hugely problematic for many reasons, right? So in it, she mostly talked about wanting to move to a bigger city and a bigger TV scene. The newspaper publishes it, and then they hand it over to the police. The police track down the source and find that it was, they find out who it was. It was one of their retired police officers' wives, which is weird, right?
Yeah.
But, like, this officer, he was a chief of police, so he had documents that belonged to the case. And so he accidentally took some home, just something shoved in old paperwork, which is like crazy. They never found, they like interviewed her, but they never found a motive. But also it's like, it's not something that should have happened in the first place, you know? Like, come on.
Yeah.
And one of the more intriguing tips, and this spiraled into a whole thing. So in 2009, Mason City police officer Maria Ull comes forward about a conversation that she overheard. She says that apparently police officers had something to do with Jodi's disappearance. She had actually heard the tip 2 years earlier, and she had kept the info to herself because she was a police officer herself and she didn't want to get in trouble. She contacted our main man, Gary Peterson, found his info on Find Jodi, on the Find Jodi site. So the story is that Maria Ull was investigating a complaint about a party, and she's there like clearing out the party, making sure everybody gets home, blah, blah, blah. And she overhears two people talking. One man said he knew that 3 officers from the Mason City PD were involved. And they also talked about the fact that, she also talked about the fact that her pastor had received a phone call from another pastor in Minnesota relaying basically the same information. So, and then they looked at this pastor. Pastor Shane Philpott contacted the police and told Officer Ull, who also happened to be his sister-in-law, said that, hey, like, you should go to your superiors about, like, he goes to the police and then he tells her that she should go to the police too. The pastor talked with the police, but at that point, him and both Marie as well felt like nobody was really listening to them, felt like they were being glossed over. They were very frustrated by the system at that point. And then soon the family hears about the rumor and that the police were involved. But they really try to stay out of it. They try to dismiss it, especially since they had been working pretty closely with the Mason City police and they were pretty, they had gained their confidence and trust and stuff like that. Maria Ull was actually put on administrative leave in September of 2010, and then she was fired in August of 2011. She was accused of mishandling information and possibly evidence. Yeah.
Sounds trumped up.
It's messed up.
Yeah.
And a psychologist actually finds her not fit for duty, and she appeals the ruling to the commission, and she tries to get reinstated as an officer, but they say no. They just totally reject her. This is when shit gets real, right? So Gary Peterson looks into these 2 informants, right, that had the information that Maria overheard. He finds out that both of them had recently died, that one died from a suspected overdose, and that there was a needle found next to the body, but he read the toxicology report and there weren't any drugs found in his system, which is weird. And then the other died from stab wounds. So I couldn't find any more information about these 2. I really wanted to get more into it, but there wasn't much there about them, but it was kind of weird to me. Like, That's weird, right? I don't know. After an internal investigation, the district rules that there were not any law enforcement officers involved in her disappearance. So, currently, John Van Cise is, at the moment, so this is an open case. He is a person of interest in the case, but, again, there's really no evidence. Jodi Huisentruit was legally declared dead in 2001. In March of 2018, the Mason City Police obtained search warrants for for any cars that had belonged to John Van Cise. And today he maintains his innocence. He continues to talk to the media. And 24 years later, the case remains unsolved.
Yeah. There's so many different theories and stuff, there's so little to go on, but so many.
There's a lot of weird coincidences
and so many bodies. There's 4 bodies that may be connected in some way, or maybe they're not at all connected,
right?
To any of them to each other.
I don't think they ever found her body.
Oh, that's right. I guess so. So, technically, she may still be alive. Who knows? seems very, very unlikely.
So, my sources?
Yes.
Disappeared, Season 6, Episode 10. I looked at findjodi.com, and I looked at a CBS News article with details from the 48-hour episode by John Axelrod, which is a dope last name. Hello, my name is John Axelrod. And a more recent, I think this was from like about a month ago, an article in the Des Moines Register by Danielle Gare, detailed stuff about the search warrants and stuff like that. But
Okay.
yeah, that is the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit.
Okay.
I hope she's... yeah, that one's sad.
Yeah.
And it's so weird, right?
All those disappeared episodes are like super tragic, but it's a pretty compelling series too.
I don't know. We started with our girl Matrice, right?
I know. Was it Matrice
Richardson.
Richardson?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. That was.
Yeah. If
that
you
was
guys
sad.
don't know the story of Matrice Richardson, I recognized the name and I was like, oh, I remember this when we watched it, and I was like, I didn't know actually how bizarre. I knew it was weird, but I didn't know it was that weird. Definitely look up the case of Matrice Richardson. It's pretty popular.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
So should we do some weird
Shit in the
news?
news.
In the news. That's weird.
Yeah, let's do it. Oh, unless I just closed all of my
I'll
tabs.
go first on this.
Yeah, go first.
Got my story from HuffPost.
Ayo.
By David Moy. Colorado woman fights off bear with baseball bat. And it's exactly what it sounds like. There's a video, you can watch the video, but essentially these mother bear and her two cubs found their way into this home in this sort of more or less rural Colorado, right? And the homeowners come downstairs and the bear and the homeowners confront each other, right? And the bear swipes at the man, and they start hitting each other. And the wife, I'll try to find her name here, but their names are John Johnson and George Ann Field. She, as she described it, picked up the bat and started hitting the bear. And basically, she said she felt like there was a lightning bolt going through her body.
What a bad bitch.
It was this, and she. What did she say? She was like, "I'm strong. Like I'm old.
Oh yeah,
but I'm strong."
she's like, I'm not weak.
Yeah.
I'm old, but I'm not weak.
I thought that was great. And between the two of them, they fought off the bears, the mother bear mainly, and were able to get away alive and everything. The husband had some very gruesome scratches across his chest, but otherwise, so yeah, that was pretty crazy. So we were wondering, how often does that happen? We don't know. Is this a normal thing in some
Yeah, I was
places?
like,
I
okay,
don't
like
know.
maybe the bear was...
They were looking for food or something,
Yeah.
obviously, but...
they did like a pan on their enormous mansion, like on the edge of the mountains. I was like,
house. They have a
oh.
nice house. Do you have something?
I do. So this is from WECT.com in a local newspaper from North Carolina. And so this one happened in Raleigh, North Carolina, sometime a few weeks ago in Wake County. So basically, okay, so the title is Death of North Carolina Man Found Bloody Wrapped in Christmas Lights, Not Suspicious, officials say. Okay, wait, let me get into this though, because I don't know that the death is suspicious, but the son is weird. So, okay, basically, so the son, he finds his dad, calls 911. And he tells the people that his father looked like he hit his head and then he bled out. He said he put a blanket over him because, quote, because he did not want him exposed, end quote, according to the warrant. So they get there and they find him dead at the bottom of the stairs by the front door, and there was a blanket over his head and there were pillows around him. And there was blood everywhere, like down the walls of the hallway near the stairs and at the bottom of the stairs on the handrail. And the son, so this is his story. He says he came home the night before around 9:30 and found the cat dead in the bathroom. According to documents, the son son said, quote, there was blood everywhere, and he took the cat and put it in the freezer wrapped in plastic, end quote. And that was when he found his dad found at the bottom of the stairs wrapped in Christmas lights. And so the son said that he cut his dad loose from the lights, and he said that, quote, his dad asked him for a blanket and pillow, which he gave to him and left him on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. And then he called his girlfriend to come pick him up, and he left. And then he returned the next day around 1 o'clock, and he finds his father dead.
This is a very strange story.
It's very, very strange. He told them, they were like, okay, like, what happened? And he told them what happened to the cat is the same thing that happened to his dad. So they actually, their theory, your face right now, their theory, investigators were able to determine, okay, quote, according to Curry, investigators were able to determine that the father was taking down Christmas lights in August when he fell down the stairs and became entangled in the lights. As he was falling, he killed the cat by falling over and landing on it. The man may have suffered a stroke, officials said.
Huh.
The son put the cat in the freezer to, quote, preserve it, end quote.
I see what you were saying earlier.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, what are we supposed to think about this?
I'm not going to think about it anymore. Thanks for listening, you guys.
You're not happy about that one.
You disturbed me, but it's fine. It's fine.
I thought it was wild.
I don't.
Rest in peace. Tragic.
Yeah.
Super tragic.
Very tragic. Yeah. Thanks.
Anyway, that wasn't great to land on.
That's okay. Thanks for listening for another week. And what are we at, 85 or something at this point? Somewhere around there.
Are you supposed to know?
I don't know. Anything. But I do know
hope
this.
You guys have a
Go
good
to our
winding
Facebook
Wednesday
and
night.
stuff. Yep. Okay.
You go to bed with dreams of dead cats in a freezer.
Oh, God.
Bye.
men wrapped in
Christmas
lights.
lights.
Okay, bye.
Stop moving.